There's conflict in the Middle East, Kelly, and a lot of founders and CHROs are asking themselves, how do we talk about this situation? And so I'll give you just a little insight into the way that we think about it at Continuum. I don't know if this is right, but I'm just going to tell you what we do, and I would love to get your take on things. We follow the Brian Armstrong, we don't talk about politics at work. In general, we are trying to build a business, and ultimately we want to be so successful that our employees get wealthy from this experience and that they can allocate their wealth to solve problems that we cannot solve as a business. So Kelly, I'm actually curious about your take and how you guys think about this and how you specifically think about solving this problem.
I will speak to this more generally in my experience as a chief people officer, and it's actually not to not talk about things at work. I tend to take the middle ground on a lot of things and try and be as inclusive as possible, but with clear boundaries, if that makes sense. So for us, a lot of the pieces around this was talk about it with groups of people that feel comfortable talking about it versus company-wide channels, et cetera, that are really there for doing business. So clubs, specific affinity groups, lunchtime meetings, communities of silence, other chat groups, right? We never shut that down. We actually encourage that. I do like the boundary element though, as far as it seeping in to the day-to-day. And for me, it's never been easy, right? Because in our roles, we might have different viewpoints. And as an example, I had a situation once, right? I'm LGBTQ, I have a wife, etc. And we have an LGBTQ affinity group, most do. And I had someone say, look, I want an affinity group for Christian conservative values that are, yes, against the LGBT, and we had to deal with that. And it was like, right? That inclusivity, I think, is a very, very common denominator that we have to solve for, is even if it's like 1% of 100, everyone should feel like they have a voice. But where you put that voice and how you have that voice interact with company-wide values and where we do business, I think that's the work.
So did you draw the line or did you create a new group?
We did not allow for a company-sponsored affinity group. Because again, I'm like, damn, what's the backbone? Like, how do I simplify? And that affinity group would fly in the face of one of our biggest values, which is respect for all.
That example is exactly the reason why I don't want to talk about it at work. Because creating that line it's arbitrary.
It is arbitrary, and it does take a lot of time. So you're saying that you didn't even have it anywhere?
Yeah, we put it in our culture docs explicitly stating we do not talk about politics at work. Our take is that many of these topics are controversial, and just getting even into that context and nuance takes up a ton of time and is a distraction. And so I know it's not like the warm and fuzzy culture. I do believe companies should indicate to candidates during the interview process how they view politics at work and let candidates either opt in or opt out. Because once somebody is there, and if you change policies on them, it's a little bit unfair because they accepted a job, with a premise or a guise of how they expected you to respond. And then you move the ball around on them. And that's where I do think Coinbase did it right, is they said, look, we are changing our policy and we are also allowing you to opt out, and we will give you severance to opt out. And I think that's done really well. And I think a lot of companies are now following in their footsteps.
I personally think that we should allow some of this conversation at work. I think it's going to happen anyway, Nolan, whether you have your handbook or not. We talked about this in our Patty episode. Like, sometimes things are slippery slopes, and all of a sudden everything is in that consideration set. So I do applaud folks like you that are like, no, keep it out. But I think that it's going to seep in anyway, I guess is my
There's
view.
not a perfect answer, I think is the short answer here. And unfortunately, founders and chief people officers do have to figure out their stance and how they navigate these issues. And so all I can recommend is to think about it beforehand. Because when you're in it, tensions rise, and it's really easy to get pulled along in a narrative or onto one side as to where you should be. And if you think about it beforehand and how you're going to respond to these sorts of things, hopefully it provides a little bit more clarity when you actually are in the fog of war.
Like, I remember when George Floyd happened and whatnot. I mean, we had leaders running around grabbing HR leaders like toddlers on their pant leg, being like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And that wasn't that long ago. I think this is fairly new.
It absolutely is.
I'm not saying it should be like that.
Well, but that's kind of my point, is like, there is a new expectation from employees that a company comments for every situation that happens. I don't think that's a fair expectation. I think your stance on it is, we will comment, but we will say, we don't know. This is really hard. And that's fair. I think another take that more companies are starting to lean into is, we're just not going to comment and talk about it. It's not perfect, because you don't want people to be robots. And I don't expect that. But I do think now, in this new world with higher interest rates, valuations lower, harder to fundraise, companies have to focus on building real businesses.
I don't think we will have a choice.
It's like another fucking thing to solve. But if you solve it when there isn't a crisis, I think it's a lot better for everybody.
I agree. But like I said, I think it will be part of the table stakes, like intake form of what companies need to think about going forward.
Totally.
But let's also empathize. This shit is not easy. Like, a lot of times companies, founders, even chief people officers avoid leaning into this until they have to, because it's scary. And there is fear of what the responses are and what the reactions are. And if I can avoid it and not deal with any reaction, that might be less distracting. But I think we are getting to a point now where that's going to be more and more impossible.
I think it is impossible. I think we're already there. The more you try and tuck this thing under the rug, the bigger the problem becomes and the harder it is to solve. For me, this is the future of work conversation. That is the real conversation around the future of work that nobody's having. HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.